When I first wrote down the title of this lecture, which is The Delights and Dangers of Ambiguity, I had no idea that the word dangers would itself acquire an ambiguous meaning by the time the lecture was delivered. I had had in mind aesthetic delights and dangers only, but a week or so ago, a formidable new danger was thrust upon us when our Secretary of State announced that the armed forces of the United States had been put on worldwide alert in response to what he called, quote, the ambiguity of some of the actions and communications, unquote, regarding respectively movements of Soviet troops and statements of Russian diplomats. And now that is dangerous ambiguity, dramatizing the dangers that accompany a lack of clarity in human communication. Those are clear and present dangers. Failure of communication can lead to a complete breakdown and to disastrous consequences. Then why this constant emphasis on the beauty of ambiguity, as I've put it, on which I was challenged last week by my blonde inquisitor, if you remember? The answer must be obvious. Ambiguity may be a useful tool in diplomacy, as it is in art, but it can be catastrophic when diplomacy turns into hard fact, just as it can be perfectly glorious in the arts. Aesthetics, see; politics, no. Now, part of the danger is that ambiguity is in itself an ambiguous word. That is, it has more than one meaning. And I think that before we go one step further into our inquiry, we would do well to have a solid dictionary definition or two. Or two, that's the problem. There are two distinct definitions arising from the dual meaning of the prefix ambi, which can signify bothness, that is, being on two sides at once, and also signify aroundness, or being on all sides at once. Now, the first connotation, bothness, yields such words as ambidextrous, ambivalent, and so on, all of which imply duality, whereas the second connotation, aroundness, conditions such words as ambience, ambit, and so on, which all relate to the general surround, thus implying vagueness. Webster gives these two definitions of ambiguous. One, doubtful or uncertain, and two, capable of being understood in two or more possible senses. Now, Webster goofed because that two or more presents an ambiguity of its own. You see, two or more than two is an ambiguity. So let's delete or more for our purposes of the moment, so that we, at least, can be clear in our human communication. Our definition now reads, capable of being understood in two possible senses. Now, everything we've been saying about puns, antithesis, zeugma, symmetry, chiasmus, yang and yin, lingam and yoni, upbeat and downbeat, strong, weak, all this has involved duality. And at some point, we've always arrived, if you recall, at a manifestation of ambiguity which arose from the basic concept of two-ness. And this idea of ambiguity has been an underlying string running through all three lectures so far, like Henry James' figure in the carpet that we mentioned last week. But we've only lightly touched on it and only intermittently sounded that string. In our first lecture, for instance, we traced a growing chromaticism in musical history based on the accretion of more and more remote overtones of the harmonic series. You remember that old harmonic series? As they were gradually accepted into common practice. And with that growing chromaticism, we found a corresponding growth of ambiguity, with a resulting need to contain that chromaticism, to control it through the basic powers of diatonicism, the tonic dominant structure of tonal music. And we found that this containment of chromaticism within diatonicism reached a state of perfect equilibrium in the music of Bach, initiating a golden age of roughly 100 years, an age of imperturbable tonal stability. But we also realized that this perfectly controlled containment is in itself an ambiguity, in that it presents two simultaneous ways in which to listen to music, via the contained chromaticism and via the containing diatonicism. And similarly, in our second lecture on syntax, we found new ambiguities in Mozart's G minor symphony, if you recall, arising from violated symmetry, deep structure symmetries which were converted by linguistic transformational procedures into beautifully ambiguous surface structures. We were then in a position to recognize and even account for certain musical phenomena whose beauty depends on ambiguous procedures. For instance, do you recognize these few bars? This adagietto from Mahler's Fifth Symphony ever since Death in Venice invaded the silver screen. Now, why the swooning? After all, it's nothing but a dominant leading to a tonic. Three conventional upbeats in F major leading to an appoggiatura downbeat, which then resolves, again, in the most conventional way. Do you remember about appoggiaturas from our Mozart analysis? Those leaning notes, remember? Dissonant tones that bear a special weight and tension that must be resolved. Notes that lean on their resolutions. Well, this is one of them. And it does resolve, as you see, just as conventionally as in Mozart. Resolution. Then what's the magic secret? Ambiguity. As if you didn't know. You see, all that preliminary vamping on the harp is, first of all, syntactically vague. We have no idea what beat we're on or what meter we're in, and already that's one ambiguity. What's more, this is setting up the key of the piece, F major, by suggesting its tonic triad, but only suggesting it because the fundamental note, the root of that triad, F itself, is missing, and only 2/3 of the triad is given us, the A and the C. Roaming through several octaves, it's true, but still only two different notes. So we're not yet really sure that our key is going to be F major. It's exactly like that kid's teasing chant that we examined for its universality in our first lecture. Remember? Nya, 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 nya. Those two notes. And do you remember how we found that the tonic fundamental of those two overtones is not sung, but is present by implication only? That fundamental. Well, that omission, the absence of this tonic, makes us only possibly aware of F major, because the two notes we hear could turn out to be 2/3 of a whole other triad, namely this one, A minor. So automatically we're facing another ambiguity. Which of these keys are we in, this or this? And that ambiguity in itself lends a certain extra poignancy to the teasing tune of the kids, because it makes it even more hurtful due to the implication of something else, something which could be nasty. Now, of course, our beloved Mahler isn't nasty at all, quite the contrary. But the principle is identical, because again, which of the two keys are we in? As the three upbeats begin, we'd almost vote for A minor, because there's that A in the cello part, which is the lowest part. But no, it sneakily descends to G and then to F. Oh, it feels so good. We're home in F major, but there's still an unresolved tug at the heart in that appoggiatura up here in the melody. And when it resolves, we just melt away with the pleasure of fulfillment. Enough ambiguity? We've barely begun. Because last week, we ran into yet a new ambiguity. Neither phonological nor syntactic, but a third one, a semantic ambiguity, a real problem in meaning. There we were, if you remember, chin to chin with Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, a piece brimming with non-musical birds and bees, and defying it to mean anything other than its own intrinsic musical metaphors. But to whatever extent we succeeded in avoiding the peasants and the cuckoos and the elephants, if you remember, one thing remained brightly unambiguous, and that was that this Beethovenian experiment in semantic conflict, namely program music, was still under perfect classical control. All its ambiguities, whether chromatic, structural, or metaphorical, were classically contained in Augustan fashion. Remember that Beethoven himself said he was trying only to suggest feelings of country life. He was not indulging in tone painting, as he put it. And the Pastoral is therefore still a monument of the Golden Age. But now, as we begin to move forward through the 19th century, we're going to find all three strains of ambiguity increasing sharply in both quantity and intensity. And before the century is finished, we'll find this epidemic increase leading us to Webster's other definition of ambiguity, absolute vagueness. And that's where the aesthetic delights of ambiguity start turning into dangers. The irony of all this is that it was Beethoven himself who started this ambiguity inflation. He was a walking, living ambiguity in himself, at once the last great classicist and the first great romantic. Just think of the scherzo from his Hammerklavier Sonata, which is based on the most innocent little diatonic tune. But now just listen to how the movement ends. Where are we? Far from home. Are we home again? Yes, we are, but it was nip and tuck there for a minute. And what about this passage later on, which bridges the slow movement into the final fugue? Just listen to this unbelievable passage. And we're suddenly in B flat. That's ambiguity rampant. We started thinking we were in A major, right? And then we went wandering, lost to the world, till we suddenly wound up in B flat. But mind you, all that blind wandering isn't so blind. It's all a modified series of tonic dominant changes, except just before the end, when it's going mad. Surprise. And we're in B flat, into the final fugue. I'm sure I don't have to mention the obvious structural ambiguity of this incredible passage. the elusiveness of the rhythm alone, and the almost savage intensity of the acceleration. And all that written without a single bar line to point the way. Now, it's evident that with Beethoven, the Romantic Revolution had already begun. You can see that. Bringing with it the new artist, the artist as priest and prophet. This new artist had a new self-image, which he promulgated onto everybody else. He felt himself possessed of divine rights, of almost Napoleonic powers and liberties, especially the liberty to break rules and make new ones, to invent new forms and concepts, all in the name of greater expressivity. His mission was to lead the way to a new aesthetic world, confident that history would follow his inspirational leadership. And so there suddenly exploded onto the scene Byron, Jean-Paul, Delacroix, E.T.A. Hoffmann, Schumann, Chopin, Victor Hugo, Berlioz, all proclaiming new freedoms. And where music was concerned, the new freedoms affected formal structures, harmonic procedures, instrumental color, melody, rhythm. All of these were part of a new expanding universe at the center of which lay the artist's personal passions. From the purely phonological point of view, the most striking of these new freedoms was the new chromaticism, now employing a vastly enriched palette and bringing with it the concomitant enrichment of ambiguity. The air was now filled with volcanic chromatic sparks, and more the upper partials of that harmonic series were taking on an independence of their own, playing hide and seek with their sober diatonic elders, like defiant kids in the heyday of revolt. And the composers themselves now had something of the defiant child in them, along with their priest and prophet images. I wish we had time to explore all their adventures, ranging from the highly personal tenderness of Schubert's modulations, all the way to the almost diabolical antics of Berlioz. We can't do all that in one lecture, but let's take just a minute to touch on Schumann. I can't ignore him. Gloriously mad Schumann, a master of ambiguity. Only think of a Schumann song such as Zwielicht with its twilight introduction, or of the fascinating punning and anagramming that goes on in a piano work like Carnival. But Schumann's really exciting sallies into ambiguity are his rhythmic ones, like this festival of asymmetry at the end of Carnival. You know this? Now that's all music in 3/4 time, but you'd never know it, would you? It's all been beautifully distorted by an overlay of 2s and 4s, and the mind reels with all these built-in ambiguities. It's like being in one of those Luna Park eccentric machines where you can never find your balance. Or take the typical Schumann device of treating a string of syncopations as though they were strong beats, all strong beats. He does it over and over again in dozens of pieces, as he does in this variation from his symphonic etudes, if I can play it. Not bad. But the main thing is, would you believe that every one of those melodic notes is off the beat? Not on the beat, but off the beat. Listen. Again, the mind reels. That's Schumann for you. And Chopin, well, we can't ignore Chopin either. With his own delicious brand of chromatic ambiguity, which is rather like harmonic seduction sensuous and teasing, like this passage from his etude in thirds. Mind you, an etude, imagine being sexy in an etude. You hear all those implied harmonic gorgeousnesses, and the implications all arise from ambiguities. Are we in the major or minor? Is this tonal or modal? Are those ninth chords or diminished sevenths? Is it the Phrygian mode? Now, you may not understand one word I've just said, but no matter, as long as you feel how this music hovers between something and something else, that's enough. You feel the ambiguous quality. Perhaps this bit of Chopin will make the ambiguous point more clearly, if that sentence is linguistically possible. This is one of Chopin's 50-odd mazurkas, and very odd they are. Quirky little masterpieces, every one. This one begins like this. Now, did that begin on a downbeat or an upbeat or where? And besides, what key is it in? We don't know. It's sort of in F. It could be the subdominant of C. It could be the submediant of A minor. It could be the Lydian mode. Well, there we go again. Never mind. It's only the introduction. Now listen to the tune. Ah, E minor, there's a possibility. But no. Chromatic side slipping. Little dying falls. Again, F-ish. Again, E minor. Chromatic. We're nowhere. Ah, at last, a cadence in A minor. So it was in A minor all the time. Talk of subtlety, of elusiveness, seductiveness. And then after, in the same little mazurka, after contrasting sections, reprises, after it's all over, Chopin gives the final ambiguous twist in the very last bars, where he, again, has arrived at A minor. We're absolutely sure it's A minor. Isn't that convincingly A minor? And then come the very last bars, which are exactly like the first bars. That's the end of the piece. What key are we in? Sort of F? Lydian mode? Well, certainly not A minor. We're left hovering as we began in a bliss of ambiguities. And they're all ambiguities born of intrinsic musical metaphors. You see, the meanings, as we discovered last week, belong to purely musical semantics. Meanings all derived from a combination of phonological and syntactic transformations. Now, I've been speaking of ambiguity as an aesthetic function, and this may seem to carry the implication that the more ambiguous music gets, the more expressive it becomes. Okay, but does that mean, for instance, that chromaticism is better than diatonic plain talk? Does it represent an advance in musical progress? Many people ask me that all the time. Is Chopin better than Mozart because he's more chromatic than Mozart? If so, then shouldn't Bartók be better than Beethoven? And the Beatles better than Bessie Smith? Is Keats more chromatic than Shakespeare? And Swinburne more than Keats? And therefore better than Keats? Foolish questions. Needless to say, I don't have to point out that it's not a question of better. These questions relate not to qualitative changes in art, but to quantitative changes. And of course Chopin is more chromatic than Mozart. But that doesn't make him a greater composer than Mozart. And of course Swinburne is more chromatic than Keats. But in what sense is Keats chromatic at all? What do I mean by chromatic in terms of literature? What is chromaticism in poetry? Well, I mean it to be the freedom to pursue that one single phonological aspect of poetic language, sound itself, to indulge in it for its own sake. A chromatic poet, as it were, seeks out new sonic relationships, just as a chromatic composer does. Relationships that are subtler, more intricate, exploiting the alphabet to its sonic limits. And such a poet concentrates on assonance, alliteration, dark vowels or bright ones, smooth labial continuants or abrupt plosive consonants, every kind of sonorific device. And by so doing, he shifts his emphasis toward this sonic area, away from syntax, away from semantics, even at the expense of clarity. Now, all this, of course, makes for ever-increasing ambiguity, always in the name of greater and greater expressivity. Let me try to read you a few lines of Gerard Manley Hopkins, and I think you'll immediately grasp what I mean. These are the opening lines of a poem called The Leaden Echo. How to keep, is there none such, nowhere known some, bow or brooch or braid or brace, lace, latch or catch or key to keep back beauty, keep it, beauty, 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 from vanishing away? Words, words, glorious words, or mud, mud, glorious mud. I prefer the former. If we didn't know that was Hopkins, we might almost think it was James Joyce. But imagine, these words were written way back in 1880. Is there is there none such, nowhere known some? It's almost music, and chromatic music at that. Hopkins is wallowing in gorgeous sounds, and so are we, his readers. But what is gained thereby, and what is lost? Well, what is lost is easily told. Structural clarity, obviously. Immediacy of meaning. The basic meaning of those lines, from a purely semantic point of view, is simply this: how to keep beauty from vanishing away, question mark. But it's a long, long trail, a winding Joycean trail of thick, sonorous beauty that leads from how to keep to vanishing away. So what is gained thereby? Well, an expressivity, an intense new expressivity, born of sheer sound, rich, complex sound that doubles and redoubles on itself, creating new meanings of its own, sonorous meanings, non-semantic meanings. Listen to this. Isn't this practically Ulysses? This is the end of that poem. When the thing we freely forfeit is kept with fonder care kept than we could have kept it, kept far with fonder care, and this is the real Ulysses part here, finer, fonder a care kept, where kept? Do but tell us, where kept, where? Yonder. What, high as that? We follow, now we follow. Yonder, yes, yonder, yonder, yonder. This ecstatic poetry has a chromaticism that leads the ear far away from the lucid C majorish meaning of how to keep beauty from vanishing away, or my heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. Instead, the ear is led toward the new pleasures of sheer sonority and on to bigger and better ambiguities, then on to Ezra Pound and to Dylan Thomas, to James Joyce, and to the ultimate reductio, Gertrude Stein, naturally, who wrote, among other things, let Lucy, Lily, Lily, Lucy, Lucy, let Lucy, Lucy, Lily, 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 and phonology has virtually taken over. Syntax is all but vanished, leaving a semantic vacuum. It would seem with all this talk of chromatic poetry that I've strayed from the main line, music, but there's method in the madness. because the Romantic Revolution we're discussing brought with it a new interaction of poetry and music. In fact, of all the arts. It's as though the arts became more interested in one another, as did the artists themselves. They began to intermingle, their various artistic media drawing closer together in mutual influence. They became painters of words, composers of pictures, poets of tones. Any aesthetic innovation, such as heightened chromaticism in music, would immediately find its counterpart in painting, or exert an observable influence on poetry. The chromatic outpourings of Berlioz are mirrored in the slashing expressionism of Delacroix, or the multicolored visions of Shelley. We begin to see a movement taking place, the Romantic movement. We begin to see artists as interrelated groups, Berlioz with Byron, Chopin with Georges Sand and Delacroix, Schumann with E.T.A. Hoffmann and Jean-Paul. Stendhal was suddenly writing a book on Rossini. Schubert and Schumann were setting their favorite poets, especially Heine. And composers like Liszt and Wagner were omnivorous readers. They not only read, but they wrote words, criticisms, memoirs, poetry, and in some cases, the entire texts of their own operas. This was a Romantic breakthrough. Just try to imagine Bach or Mozart as literary buffs. Ausgeschlossen. Now, the pivotal point in all this interdisciplinary action is, as we know, Beethoven. There he was, still the great master of the classical Viennese school, already casting adumbrations of the musical and extra-musical fusions that were to come. A detailed programmatic symphony, such as the Pastoral, or the Ninth Symphony with actual sung words in it, these were truly Romantic innovations. There'd never been anything like them before. But it remained for Berlioz, who adored Beethoven, to grab onto that extra-musical concept, that new semantic ambiguity, and make it his banner. His first major work, the Symphonie Fantastique, written barely 3 years after Beethoven's death, mind you, was like the Pastoral Symphony raised to the nth power in terms of programmatic meaning. And from there on, it was literary attachment all the way, whether to Shakespeare, or to Byron, or to Virgil, from whose Aeneid he fashioned the libretto of his own opera, Les Troyens. Do you know that in all of Berlioz's output, there exists only one little piece that does not have literary associations, one little violin piece in a lifetime of composing, something called Reverie and Caprice for violin and orchestra, not worth looking at. But everything he wrote was either opera, oratorio, cantata, songs, or very explicit program music. So there is a dramatic change from Beethoven's programmaticism to that of Berlioz, a qualitative change. Literary ideas are now inextricably tied in with music. Berlioz wants us to be aware of specific literal meanings, not merely of suggested feelings, as in Beethoven's Pastoral. Those jonquils and daisies, which last week were only suggested, are now really blazing with color, and those mosquitoes really bite. And all this now forces the listener into a new auditory attitude. He's got to listen on two levels at once, a purely musical level and an extra musical one. See, when we listen to Berlioz, we must perforce embrace this new semantic ambiguity. We're not permitted to ignore it, as we did last week, or tried to, with Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. Berlioz is the arch romantic. And it's always oddly surprising to recall how close he was to Beethoven, not only in terms of period, but in terms of stylistic and formal elements as well. We tend to think of Berlioz as the essential romantic madman and of Beethoven as the titan of classicism, worlds apart. Well, actually, their worlds are contiguous, even overlapping. And among the stylistic legacies inherited by Berlioz are most strikingly those very chromatic ambiguities we were listening to earlier in Beethoven's Hammerklavier Sonata. And again, it was Berlioz's historic mission to seize on those ambiguities and magnify them to gigantic proportions. So it's, after all, not so surprising that in the decade directly following Beethoven's death, Berlioz was spinning this extraordinary series of notes. This subtly tinted thread, as modern in its way as a contemporary tone row, is the opening phrase of a movement from Berlioz's Romeo and Juliet, which he called a dramatic symphony. By dramatic, he meant that Shakespeare's drama is told musically with added choral and solo voices, but all the great moments are purely orchestral, the really great moments, like the street fight, Mercutio's Queen Mab speech, the ball scene, the balcony scene, the tomb scene. All these are told by the orchestra alone in highly pictorial terms. Now, we're about to hear one of these symphonic movements performed on tape by the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and I'd like to prepare you for some of the ambiguous beauties to come, not the least of which is the semantic ambiguity of having to listen to this music on two levels. Now, this 10-minute excerpt, or 12 minutes, I don't know, it depends on my mood. I can play it awfully slowly, but it's around 10 minutes. This excerpt depicts the scene early in the play when Romeo is about to meet Juliet at the Capulet ball. They haven't met yet. He's alone, lovesick, vague, restless, waiting for his imminent destiny. And Berlioz captures this ambiguous ambience by spinning those notes I just played, a solitary melodic line with no harmony at all underneath it. The harmonies are all implied, but which harmonies? What is implied by that last E flat? Or by this A flat? Or this D flat? They are all non-diatonic tones, chromatic tones on the fringes of F major. Or is it F minor? Both are implied, and that's already a basic ambiguity. Now, if you noticed, all three of those dubious notes I pointed out occur in little chromatic descents, dying falls, imitating lovesick sighs. Now that's tone painting. That's the very thing Beethoven insisted he was not doing. But Berlioz still reminds us that he's Beethoven's disciple by punctuating this vague opening phrase with a lightly plucked touch of the dominant triad. His ambiguity, you see, is still being classically contained in a tonal framework. There's no doubt what that is or where we are. But once having reminded us, he is then free to go on immediately to new ambiguities. So here's his second phrase, a totally foreign key, E minor, now with rising chromatic size. And now we seem to land in E major. But no, more chromatic vagueness, and we're back in F. Well, it seems like good classical containment, but not for long, because here's F sharp minor. Or is it? No, it's F. You see, the music is trying hard to establish this tonic key of F major, even while it's wandering on, moody and unstable. And just as it succeeds in reaching a solid F major cadence, which is already 3 or 4 minutes into the piece, there is a sudden interruption let's see, the cadence is reached like this. Sudden interruption. Very softly, the distant rhythms of the Capulet ball intrude on Romeo's consciousness. And here's a new ambiguity, surprising as an alarm clock. Observe, Romeo's reverie is just reaching that cadential close in F when it's interrupted by the dance music in D flat major. Not exactly interrupting, you see, but rather coinciding with the end of the cadence. You follow what I mean? Here's the end of the cadence coming up, and it's the beginning of the surprise. In other words, that final F of the cadence, which is the tonic note, is suddenly not the tonic, but the third degree of a whole other scale, D flat. Now, this is called in the trade an enharmonic modulation, based on the well-tempered fact that the note F is common to both keys, F major and D flat major. You hear? F, same note in D flat. And so that instant in musical time of expecting one harmony and getting another, that mighty principle of the violation of expectation, is really a double instant, an immeasurable instant of ambiguity, achieved through a device musicians call a deceptive cadence. Now, in that deceptive instant, we hear, so to speak, both tonalities at once. We hear the F major tonality because it's in our inner ear, since we anticipate it, but we never get to hear it. But that's what's in our inner ear. And then we actually hear the D flat major because it's actually sounded, violating our expectation. And the actual dance tune over that rhythm is, of course, created straight out of those sighing chromatic descents we heard in Romeo's reverie. Those lovesick sighs. And by transformation, you see, it's now become dance music, highly rhythmic. It's only a short flash, one phrase carried by the breeze from the Capulet Palace, but it's just enough to stir up new ambiguities in Romeo, shifty, chromatic tremors. You see how exact Berlioz is about his meanings, about the semantic meanings, the non-musical meanings. Now, Romeo is all stirred up by shifty feelings, chromatic feelings, tremors. Shall I go to the ball or not? After all, I'm a Montague, an enemy, but I'm strangely moved to go, drawn by that dance rhythm. And so Romeo sings, or rather the oboe sings, a clear diatonic love song. Diatonic, non-chromatic, because it is now a clear decision to attend the festivity, right? And this song is always punctuated by that distant magnetic dance rhythm. Another ambiguity, but a perfectly clear one, belonging uniquely to the art of music, Romeo's song and the ball music together. Only in music can two such disparate messages travel simultaneously and not only be distinctly perceived as counterpoint, but actually reinforce each other. Certainly the most striking case of this musical simultaneity, literally double entendre, hearing double, occurs at the climax of this movement, the ball, when Romeo has arrived at the dance festivities and the dance music is now brilliant and full out, and he sees Juliet and he dances with her, all in clear, joyful F major. And at this moment, we actually hear two musics together. Half the orchestra is batting out the beat of the dance music, while the other half is blaring out in full cry Romeo's love song. This is, if you recall, a clear case of contrapuntal syntax, a mechanism of ambiguity that's possible only in musical terms. And this double event is constantly reinforced by the simultaneous contradiction of that bright diatonic sound and the chromaticism of Romeo's yearning, which persists throughout the dance music in upper voices and in the middle voices, as you'll hear, and right up to the end in the bass. And the whole piece is a triumph of ambiguities. Let's listen to it now. And any of you who would like to follow the score with me at the desk are welcome to gather around and do so. Roll that tape.